Pseudocide, the latest release from Casefile Presents, is out now. You can listen to all 9 episodes for free on Spotify. In this video, I sit down with the creators of the show, Fiennes and Damon, and we have a chat about their latest podcast. Hi, it's Mike from Casefile and Casefile Presents. On this channel, I'm releasing videos on podcasting and audio production, so if you enjoyed it, hit the like button. Pseudocide is the latest podcast from Casefile Presents. It is the show about faking your own death, lies, and deception. 9 completely different stories, 9 episodes that dive deep into death fakery. I sit down with Fiennes and Damon, creators, producers, and hosts of Pseudocide, and we have a chat about the production of the show. My role in the production was post-production. So after they've recorded the interviews and composed the show, the episodes, I then took over, cleaned the dialogues, the audio clips, done the flow edits, I've mixed, I've mastered the episodes, and of course, I wrote the music for the show. I hope you enjoyed this interview, and let's get started. Hello, Alice and Poppy. Thank you for joining me tonight. And how are you this evening?
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Good. Well, I want to start with a more general question about the idea for the show. How did you come up with the idea, and why? Why did you want to tackle this topic?
Well, we came up with the idea coming up to 3 years ago now, wasn't it? When Arkady Babchenko, Russian journalist, faked his own death. It first hit the headlines as apparently a murder. People were suspecting Russian operatives. 48 hours later, I think he appeared alive and well at a press conference. You were working in the BBC newsroom at the time. So you were kind of all over the coverage of it, weren't you, Poppy?
Yeah. And it was it was one of those draw on the floor moments, because he showed up at his own press conference, meant to be briefing the world's journalists about his death. And there he was to tell them it was all a ruse. And Alice and I started having a conversation and saying, well, who are the other people who fake their own death? How can you fake your own death? And we found there's actually loads. Once you started Googling, there's loads of stories of Pseudocide. So that was kind of the springboard and the spark, and we started to work on it from then.
Yeah, Babchenko episode, what a story. And from a production point of view, I'll say was one of the more challenging episodes as well. Lots of interviews, and not only that, but we had Russian as well as actors dubbing the Russian, changing one of my favorite stories as well. But then going to the idea, 3 years, but we did meet in December 2019 and then discussed your idea and the podcast. What was your plan for the next few months when recording and writing?
What was our plan? Going back to December 2019. I do remember it well, actually. We met in that Pret, didn't we, in London Bridge back in the day when you could meet in Prets. Right. And we began production soon after that. We began interviewing people soon after that. And we had kind of sketched out a plan for who we wanted to interview when. That was very quickly scuppered by the COVID-19 pandemic, which reared its ugly head in March 2020, as we all know. So, we were kind of just a couple of months into doing interviews when we had to really start rethinking our plan.
And I would say that Alice and I work in a unusual way, perhaps, in that because we're co-producers, co-hosts, we do divvy up. We kind of had a lead producer on each episode. And that way, originally we were going to do 12, it became 9. We kind of had each of us lead on whatever it was, 3 and then 5 or 4 and 5, whatever it was. And then that meant that, because a lot of it is like trying to get access, very early on, and you want to establish relationship and trust. So we're kind of making that groundwork, realizing which episodes are going to work and which aren't, and then starting to interview and think about, as you go along, a structure, how you get into that story, what sound design we might want to do. For example, in the Case Nicole episode, we have someone who is not who they say they are, without giving too much away. And we quite early on, I think, decided to have like this big audio reveal that was meant to be like the Sixth Sense moment, which Mike did an amazing job bringing to life and making a reality. But those ideas come along as you're speaking to people and as you're building it. And we often have our entry point and our end point, because that kind of helps you structure it. But I would say, yeah, that's kind of the main parts, is just getting that access initially.
Yeah, access. And then, as you say, with the kind of, in terms of workflow for each story, it's really important for us to kind of know where we want to end up when we begin. It just helps everything fall into place so much more easily. It doesn't mean we're not led down some surprising pathways sometimes, but as a starting point, knowing where you want the story to end is always a good way to begin.
Yeah, absolutely. But then, going to the pandemic and lockdowns, did it affect your recording schedule? Did you have more in-person interviews lined up, and then you had to switch to remote recording because of that?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, for example, I would say the main episode we thought we would do in person was in going to Ukraine and trying to work with the fixer there to tell the Arkady Babchenko story. That's somewhere that's not too far for us, but also we thought we could get a really good sense of place and really be able to probe and speak to those characters. In the end, what we quickly had to do was rely on a fixer who's someone who works locally and was sort of our eyes and ears on the ground. He was a fantastic fixer called Damon, and he basically was able to get the access, and we sort of did interviews through him. He met someone in a cafe, and then we, dubbed it over later through translations. But that's, in a way, it forced you to act really creatively. Like how, otherwise you just end up with a lot of two ways or long discussions. We had to kind of say, how can we get some audio in here? How can we get some sound design? Yeah. So in a weird way, it's like a challenge we were set and hopefully overcame.
Yeah, totally. Like it makes you think more about how you can make things into more of a scene. And so we kind of lent into that in that Arkady Babchenko example, and tried to really make Dima, our fixer, a kind of character in the story as well. And kind of bring him in that way. Hopefully it paid off, as you say. And similarly, we thought we might go to Ireland for the Fernando story. So we kind of had to pull in other audio elements there. It really did kind of change our style creatively, I think, for the series, for certain episodes.
It must be a challenge to interview people online or over the phone, though, instead of in person, when you're able to build that rapport with somebody, face to face. So did you have experience with that, recording and interviewing people over the phone in the past, or was that sort of new ground for you?
You're so right. And I think the big thing for us is that it's specifically crime interviews that are hard to do remotely, because they're all about intimacy and trust. Like we're talking about people who've lost a friend, lost a brother in the course of the events we're discussing. And it can feel quite cold if you're not able to look them in the eye. You're not able to maybe, reach out and comfort them if they become upset. It can be quite a cold experience. Sometimes we've been forced through the fact that we've often done stories based in the US, that we have done a lot of remote interviews. So luckily we were able to quite quickly transition into, we use Squadcast in the end, but you could use Zencaster or Prereq or any of the other ones that allow you to record locally and get that in quality. But we did discover, for example, with our interview with Ramon, that having the camera on does actually build that intimacy. And I think early on, I regret maybe I didn't always have the camera on because I was thinking about bandwidth. Right, yeah. But because you've got the local recording usually with their phone, we probably could have just done the video and then dealt with the fact that it wasn't a perfect line. I think one of the early interviews I did on Skype, because I hadn't quite realized about Squadcast yet. So, you kind of learn that stuff a bit along the way.
Definitely. The phone recording thing really helped us, because almost everyone has a smartphone these days, and they're so much better than they used to be at recording. Voice recorder on, voice memos on iPhones really helped us out a lot with this.
And we discovered that you can set it to not be compressed, which again, most people were really happy to change that setting, and it makes a huge difference in the quality of the audio.
So yeah, it was a quick we had to adapt quickly, I think, to working fully remotely, as everyone did in the pandemic. But fortunately, there was kind of so much software developing and coming out that helped us out. But yeah, it's always a shame, I think, as Poppy says, in terms of intimacy, to not be able to connect with someone. And you know, there is a value to being able to go into someone's space and see where they live, and you know, that can really make a fuller and more vivid picture of them, and be more dynamic and interesting to listen to. So I think it was hard to kind of develop the stories without that element, and it again made us try and be more creative with how we could build those scenes and create kind of more texture for the listener.
I would also say my other tip for doing a remote interview is maybe do more than one, because there's intimacy grown through that. And also making sure you have enough time. Like, you know, for Babchenko and Ramon and a couple of other interviews were well over an hour, sometimes closer to 2 hours. And that's, you know, just for trying to make a half an hour to 45-minute episode. But that time means you can get all the material that you need and boil it into something really good.
Yeah, totally. You don't want to have to worry about rushing. And yeah, to a more than one interview or a good preliminary chat before the interview can really, really help the process along.
Yeah, that's a really good advice. Sort of get them to know a little bit before you hit that record button, and then just having a chat rather than an interview you'd expect on TV or something else. And I think a lot of people moved on from that thanks to moving on online, but also things like podcasts, when you are not limited by that late night 10-15 minute interview, but you have 3-hour long conversations. And a lot of people are comfortable with watching and sort of listening to that sort of stuff. When we talk about you recording people, though, was there specific software or equipment that you use, that you tend to use, both in person and online?
So in person, we have a Marantz that we share, which actually, it's so funny because I used to always use them at the BBC and I really liked Marantz, but now I've been kind of converted to the Zooms, to be honest. But we use that with a now what's it called? It's an Audio Technica, but it's a mic that you run into that with an XLR cable, and that can be really fun for out and about, and you can kind of get Atmos as well as do your interviews. So that worked really well. And then when we did the remote interviews, as discussed, we kind of did Squadcast, local recordings, phones for the guest. Through my work, I've kind of learned that actually USB mics can be really good. So maybe in another season, we would just get like 5 USB mics that we could share amongst guests and then run that through Squadcast, and it might work better than the phone, and you actually have less work to do at that end. And then when we were in the studio, which were called Red Light Studios.
Red Light Studios in Soho.
Yeah, they had what was the type of mic they had?
They had Neumann mics. They offered us, they kind of asked us if we wanted that sort of crackly broadcast sound, or if we wanted something cleaner, more like a kind of like David Attenborough voiceover, and we opted for the latter. But yeah, they were lovely mics to work with. It was a great studio, actually. And I've recently actually been using, for another podcast project, a USB mic, which is a Rode mic, NT-USB it's called. And that's really good. It's really affordable, comes with a pop filter on it already. So they're great too.
Yeah, whenever someone asks me, or even on my blog, I always recommend USB microphones, especially for people who are not that versed in audio setup. And because you don't need audio interface, you don't need XLR cables, you just plug and play. However, I tend to recommend dynamic rather than, a lot of these USB microphones are condensers. And for people recording at home, suddenly you pick up everything around you, rather than with dynamic, you got that cardioid, polar pattern, and they're not as sensitive. And a lot of people want to use this one, which is SM7B, you see it everywhere. And what Shure did they've just released equivalent of SM7B as USB microphone. So people
I
can
didn't know
buy
that.
this one as USB, plug it in, and have the similar sound, which at least I find quite interesting. But going back to your recording, it's really very interesting how you approach it. I don't do any location recording at all, sort of more in post-production scene. But when you record, I think one of the questions that people don't often ask is about archiving and what do you do with the files. I want to ask if you just keep them on the SD card or go and double them up straight away. How do you
So I
save them?
basically live in constant fear that
my
the SD
God.
card is corrupted and you've lost everything. So
Yeah.
we pretty much, so I've got a newer Mac, so it doesn't have a USB adapter, but
Same.
I have one of these, which I don't know what you call them,
same.
but the adapter. Then I have a USB, an SD card reader. I put that in. One thing I've learned recently is to make sure also that your SD card is formatted to Mac, because quite often they're just like naturally not compatible, which means that I have to put it into someone else's computer, run it in, definitely put it on my local drive, and then we also have a shared Dropbox. One thing I'm really passionate about is labeling also what is in that file, because if you do it straight after you just recorded, you'll know that you did it in 3 parts. The first part is just you saying hello and having a cup of tea. The next part's the really emotional section. And the third part's a little funny thing where you just turn the mic on again. And if you don't get back to your edit for another 6 months and you've left it as 0 file 1-H25, then you're going to completely forget what it is. And it's also harder to search for. If I was being really strict with naming conventions, you would try and do like last name, date, and episode. We probably do sometimes get a bit slack, and you put like
We probably do,
person making
make
tea,
it up as we go
and you
along
kind
a
of
bit, but
name it.
Yeah.
But the other great thing is, because we use Descript, once you have that local saving on your computer in your Dropbox, you can then put it in Descript, and it's also backed up in a cloud. It's transcribed, and you can have folders within there that are really tidy, and you can keep track of stuff. In terms of field recording, you want to be getting your room noise. You want to be making sure you start rolling before you meet the person, because you can get some great greeting, and you want to get a bit of farewell. Again, we didn't get to do so much of this. You won't hear it in this podcast, but when we've done other stuff, you just want to over record. You just want that funny dog barking and them saying down dog, whatever. And
ringing
doorbells, tea kettles boiling, all that stuff.
All the natural atmos, for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, naming conventions and archiving is something that was drilled into me back when I worked at Pinewood and stayed with me. And I think it's half of the job. So, color coding, all that.
Yeah.
And at the end of my day, I always archive it to external drive, make sure I have at least 2 saved copies. And, you can sleep at night with that.
Definitely.
And you mentioned the scripts. I want to move now to post-production. Was that the software in which you actually edited the episodes?
So Descript, for anyone who doesn't know, allows you to store all your audio, but it also allows you to, every time you edit the words, it actively edits your kind of timeline, your actual project, and then you can bounce it or export it into Reaper or Pro Tools or whatever you prefer to use. Massive pros is that if you're making a show like ours that's heavily narrative and has lots of archive and clips and all that, it's so easy to move stuff around. And we were also not able to be together, so we could leave notes for each other. We could be checking each other's work, and it just made it so collaborative, like a Google Doc. But the cons are it isn't, it's not perfect editing software. So you're not able to smooth edits in the same way that you would if you were building a project outside of a timeline. And when we've worked on other projects, we used a Google Doc that the sound and designer then built from as just like a script from the raw material, and the clips would match the file names that we had in the project. But that is very slow and would have probably taken a lot more time.
Yeah, it's it definitely has its advantages in that sense. Google Docs, our method when we were using Google Docs, we found quite complicated, quite error prone and confusion prone, and Descript was really streamlined a lot for us and made a lot much more efficient, much faster. As Poppy says, there are things you need to watch out for with it, and it's not perfect, but certainly for podcasts which are quite heavy in voiceover like ours, it's quite an intuitive process, and it's very easy to use, and it really helps you write around your interview material.
And did you compose the episodes within the script, or was the idea, like you said, written somewhere else, the structure of it, or how did you go about that?
It's a bit of a mixture, really, and it depends slightly on the episode. The nature of the interviews, the nature of the interviewees leads that process a bit. So there are some episodes which were really driven by a single core interviewee, and those we could really build from the beginning in Descript, because you're mainly being led by what that core interview is. So an example is our episode 6, which the kind of core interviewee there is Ramon Sosa. He was a brilliant speaker and told the story really well, and already kind of had quite a full narrative arc in there. So that was a question of taking that interview, cutting it down into the kind of main narrative beats that were already in his story, and then writing around that and pulling in other elements. For other stories, which are possibly about more historical figures, or where there isn't kind of a single narrator telling their own story, and it's much more in the round, told by lots of different people, it can be helpful, or we find anyway, to begin scribbling on bits of paper, maybe drawing out what you think the narrative arc will be, writing notes, and then kind of getting into the script and playing around with interview material.
That is interesting. And this working within the script, did it affect your overall vision for the style of the show, or was that something you had in mind before you even started? And how did you imagine the music will support this show as well? Because you are working without music in the script.
Yeah, so we definitely always have quite a lot of chats before we start making episodes about what other shows we want it to sound like. And, we're very influenced by Love and Radio, This American Life, a lot of Gimlet shows, really those kind of American narrative styles and sort of sensibilities that we kind of like to apply to our work. So with that in mind, I guess when we're building, we often think about things in a cinematic way. So we think about an opening scene, we think about protagonists, and that's already kind of there. And because we've worked together for such a long time, we kind of know that that's our taste and what we like to listen to and what we want to try and recreate. But we, I guess in terms of sound design, we always like it quite pared back, and we almost think if you're aware of the music, then maybe something's gone wrong. It should really like complement what you're hearing and just kind of carry you along and transport you to a mood, without being kind of like the main thing that means you can't actually focus because you're so distracted by like an amazing drum and bass beat or something. So thanks to Mike's amazing work, we hope that that's been pulled off in this one. But I would say that Descript for me has just been so amazing because you are able to experiment more, because it's very easy to shuffle stuff around and have a new edit that's duplicated, and you just say, well, we're going to put the beginning at the end and see if that works. You can color code, you can do a pickup and just paste it over and just have changed wording slightly. You can do rough cuts. Often what we like to do is actually record a version and listen and really experience it like that, because you can look at a screen too long and then you don't really know what you're doing anymore. So for me, that's hugely empowering, and you're able to be a bit more flexible than I think sometimes once you've put something on a timeline and you're working in Reaper or Pro Tools, you feel more weirdly that you don't want to move stuff because it could just screw up everything.
Yeah.
Nothing to add.
Sorry.
We've said it all.
All the things to say.
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, definitely. Programs and software like that, they are very helpful for podcast producers who wanna do both, work within that script and audio at the same time. And then as they evolve, hopefully, like you said, the editing, the cutting of actual audio gets better as well. But I want to talk about music as well, and just want to say that for me, I think it was one of the most challenging projects that I had to do, and it was because I'm so entrenched in that true crime case file style of doing audio. And naturally, when I started, he was like, yeah, okay, I'll do what I do. And it was only after you said, well, hold on, that's not what we want. I had to take myself out of that comfort zone and really think about it. But because you had such a strong vision for that show and could express it well, then we could sort of work together. And in the end, I think we're all proud how it turned out. I know I am, because it really pushed me to approach it in a very different way that I would normally do. So yeah, thank you for that as well. But it was a challenge, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, well, we loved how the music's turned out. It sounds great. But yeah, I think those, it was kind of new for us as well in some ways, like, because there's so much variation in this series in terms of the types of stories. So
yes.
Yeah, I think, it was an evolution, certainly, and a real kind of more than the sum of the parts of all the people involved, because it was such a process of bouncing it back and forth.
Yeah, and I would say that that point about the challenge you actually had was they all needed to feel part of the same series and have a DNA that made it Pseudocide, but also literally every story was a different time, a different tone, and some are actually just quite funny and impish, and some are really dark and tragic. So I didn't envy you having to try and compose and take from what was in our brain and
right. We didn't make it easy for you, but I think that's a really good way of putting it, the sort of core DNA that runs through it. And it does have that. I think you've done an amazing job with that.
Well, thank you. I think it was like a switch that flicked in me at one point when I didn't think of it, like you said, it was one show, but it was 9 different stories. So rather than just doing one bit of music and then put it out, I thought, we're gonna do a different style for each episode, and then different style of the main theme will open each episode. And that really pushed me to sort of search for and get inspired, rather than just do what I do, which is this sort of dark tones and ominous tones, true crime, which I still like, but I don't tend to do anything else, not as often as I'd like anyway. But I want to move to your narration, and it was all written down, and I want to ask about recording. You mentioned the studio in Soho, so that's, I presume, where you recorded. Was it both of you at the same time? How long did the session take? Was there somebody else, or how did it look?
Well, we went to this studio, as we said, Red Light Studios in Soho, and it was kind of still height of, where are we? Second wave, was it? Third wave. The waves have all blurred into one. But anyway, there was a wave. We were in it. So it was very much a kind of social distance studio, but they had kind of a setup with 2 tables opposite each other. So Poppy and I were facing each other recording, which is helpful for the sort of dynamism and the sense that, a sense of flow between the 2 narrators, even though we're not talking to each other. It's so helpful to be able to bounce off each other. So we went and we recorded over a day and a half, the 9 episodes, which was quick. We sort of packed it in, didn't we, Poppy? And I think with hindsight, we'd maybe take a little bit more time, not loads more time, but maybe just slow it down a bit more, have a bit more breathing space, a bit more time for the vocal cords to recover.
Yes.
Yeah.
Between episodes.
Well, we definitely learned from it that the mornings are just a bit of a write-off, because your voice just hasn't warmed up, and we really would. You've booked this studio, you've paid for it, and it puts the pressure on. So I probably would have we would have done like 3 or 4 days and just on the afternoons, and it probably would have been less stressful, and you would have had less retakes because your voice is cracking. So we definitely started Googling like some remedies for that. And I would say we also had a sound engineer there. Shout out to Drew and Craig at Red Light Studios. And they were there really, obviously to make us sound great and to make sure there were no fluffs, and they had a copy of the script. But the fortunate thing about having 2 hosts is we do always produce each other. So, Alice will say, you need to retake, that was too fast. Or I'll say like,
swallowed that word.
A classic thing, you also you think you've checked it all, but you suddenly realize you need the pronunciation of a name. The great thing about WhatsApp is if there's someone's name we're not sure of, you can just say, can you voice note me how you say that? But it's just all those things, we definitely were doing dry runs and practicing, and you come across little things you realize don't quite sound right. But there's always stuff that crops up once you're in the room, and having a second person to bounce it off and problem solve is really helpful. And I really feel for people who have to do it on their own in some ways, because you don't have that editor sitting beside you.
Absolutely. That's one of the big challenges for podcasters as well. I would think, because you kind of do it yourself rather than being in a studio with the team of recorders and editors and all that. So would you say that was the biggest challenge for you, packing it in day and a half, 9 episodes, or was it something else being in the studio? Because you've done it before, so it wasn't as intimidating, I suppose.
Yeah. For us, being in the studio was actually a big upgrade. So in our previous life, when we did another show, we did the old USB mic into the computer, duvet over the head. We actually made a room with mattresses and
the mattress room. I forgot about that.
And then it was hot, uncomfortable. We couldn't really leave because the doors were barred shut. It's just really not workable. So for us, like a studio where there was tea made for us, and like you could go to the loo and everything was like such a treat.
Yeah, and you can just relax. Everything's set up, and it's designed with that intention in mind, like a mattress.
If you're peaking or you pop, there's someone else checking that, and it's very hard to be thinking of your voiceover and also checking that it's recording correctly. So I would say that's the best investment we made. Like, I think we early on said for us it was important that was something we prioritized for the process and just how it sounds at the end. For me, I would say that the hardest bit is always just simply the writing. I kind of, when you dive off and you're getting guests, you're getting access, I find that bit quite easy. And then it's like, once you've got all your raw material, and you have to really just work out, how do you tell this story that you've maybe known for 8 months, build in surprises, build in twists and turns, and make it make sense. That is definitely the hardest bit.
Totally. I agree. I think with the, bidding guests and interviewing them, there are kind of steps you tick off there. And the plan is kind of set out for you or easy to make. Whereas once you're in the process of writing, it could happen quickly. It can take a while. You can kind of hit stumbling blocks. It can be a lot, there can need to be a lot of trial and error with figuring out what works. So in the whole process, it's an incredibly rewarding part, but it contains a lot of unknowns. It contains more unknowns and harder workarounds, I think, than, bidding guests. With the actual recording, as Poppy says, amazing being in the studio. But I think, for that portion of making the podcast, I think just doing so many different stories back to back and trying to keep on top of everything, making sure everything is correct and you're hitting everything you need to when your brain has to switch between so many different subjects is difficult. Yeah.
No doubt. So many different stories and big challenge to present them under one banner of one show, Pseudocide, but you did pull it off. It really, really amazing work. And I always say as well, when it comes to recording, good quality at source is the most important bit, because fix it in the mix later in the mix. It never quite works like that. And especially for narration, I think it was a good shout to go into a studio. But I always as well advise, when we record Casefile or whatever, when your voice is trained, vocal cords, then just leave it for the day. It's not worth it. So maybe next time, I think, like you say, a few more days, easier afternoons, hot green
Yeah, there are a
tea.
couple of croaky moments, I think, in the series, from me at least, anyway.
No, it did sound great. I couldn't believe when you told me you've done it in like one day. Yeah.
Like, I mean, the thing was, we had a theory about being warmed up, which, as I say, is just rubbish because your voice exhausts. But also, we thought, I think the problem is you build up being able to do it in a contained time, and you're like, you make these kind of schedules, and you just got to basically add a day to what you think. I would say
that's true, actually. Yes, add a buffer of a day at least, if not more, to anything you plan to do.
Yeah, when I set my deadlines, I give myself a week. So my deadlines are always a week or even more if I can before, because there's always something. There's always something, some emergency edit and fix. Yeah, happens. But I think being two of you in the studio was also helpful. Having not that much time, you motivated yourself and maybe sort of pushed yourself to actually do it. If it was just one person, be like, oh, what time is it?
That's the other thing, actually, I hadn't really thought about, but there are some lines that just, for whatever reason, our personalities, whatever, just Alice says and it sounds amazing, and if I said it just doesn't work, and vice versa. And that is such a privilege as well. I mean, I find some pronunciations really hard, and if I can't say it after a few takes, that is when it becomes Alice's line.
Yeah,
because I totally,
yeah.
So I feel bad for people who don't have that option of giving it someone else.
It's great for me the other way around. Like, if you get stuck on certain words sometimes, and your tongue gets tied up, or you get a block about the intonation of something, and it's so good to have someone else you can just hand it over to.
Yeah.
And after a while, the words and lines just stop making sense. Like, what
they mean absolutely nothing at all.
When it comes to editing, did you do it yourself in Descript, or people at the studio, or you had somebody else for the narration for the VOs?
So we did have production support from a brilliant producer called Elizabeth Nicano, and that was sometimes also because it's quite hard to listen to yourself or even each other, especially when we did the recording. So I think did Elizabeth actually pick our takes? I actually can't remember. Did we pick our takes? I think
Elizabeth picked our takes from the voice, from
that was another
narration,
treat we gave ourselves.
Yeah,
we hired Elizabeth to do those takes, and then we listened, and now and then it would be something we thought, we preferred a different take, but otherwise it was great having that fresh pair of ears come and just take that our recording and just pick out the right one. That we didn't edit those ourselves.
Yeah, it's always good to bring somebody with a new perspective, especially when you've been on it for so long. You can just lose that objectivity. And then I came in for post-production. We had a lot of drafts, a lot of fixes, a lot of notes. Would you say that the final version of the episodes of the show was close to your vision, the vision you had before you started, or how did it turn out in your opinion?
Definitely. I think it is always a process, because you do follow things along the way, but I would say it's very much what we hoped.
Very much what we wanted, and what we planned. I think, as Poppy says, you discover things along the way that maybe don't work, or that you were wrong about, and you would have to adapt and be flexible. I think the biggest discovery point for us was probably the music. And I think we knew we knew that we wanted it to be kind of light accents and transitions, and we knew what sort of style we wanted. But as we discussed earlier, that process of really threshing out how you make something so diverse hang together was probably the part of the vision that was least fully formed and most realized kind of in the process of post-production.
And also, words aren't very good at expressing music a lot of times. So sometimes it's so much better you going like this, no, like this, no, like this, yes. Because, romantic or gothic can mean very different things to different people. What became really helpful was that you were quite good at finding instruments that were probably going to be the main feature. So it was like very strings and very plucky in Casey. There was a more of a rock theme for Clayton. And once we had those, it was kind of easier to then be all on the same page. But I don't know how you get over that. I mean, I feel like I have a better way of expressing music now from this process.
Yeah, from being forced to do it. But I agree with you. There were just times when the words felt so inadequate, and you can't really be sure if someone else understands, you know, if I say scary to you, like what that conjures. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Did you find that too, Mike?
I find that music, composing for other people, writing for other people, is very tricky, very difficult. And when I left my job and started on Casefile, and I just done the production on 1 or 2 episodes when Casefile started, and then the host asked me if I write music as well. But I had bad experience with sort of doing music for people, and I really didn't want to do that. I said, no, that's just stuff I do for myself. But then my girlfriend, now my wife, Paulina, said, just try it out. Maybe it will work. And, 5 years later, now like 200 episodes, different shows, I have to thank him for sort of giving that chance. And now I feel confident enough to, I guess, work with other people. But I absolutely agree. It's so difficult because you're bringing somebody else on who may be able to share your vision, but will have their own style anyway, because it's music. It's so subjective. And
Exactly.
I have a feel for something completely different that you may feel for that. And getting that to work and being on one page is tricky. But I've learned that it's a process. So rather than giving you the final product, there you go, take it or leave it, I rather work on every step, which is also changing because then I'm sending you sort of temp music, which not necessarily is what I'm hearing in my mind or what I imagine to be on the final episode, but I want to give you at least a little bit of how it will sound. And from that, you have to give me a feedback thinking, that doesn't sound that great. But it is a process. I'm not going to lie, it's challenging.
Definitely. It kind of is a bit like graphic designers often complain that clients will say two contradictory things. And I always think about that because, they'll say like, I want it fun and fruity and fresh, but also solemn and grown up, like, how do you marry those two things? And the only way really is to start painting or drawing and saying like, is this kind of what you mean, or this? And I definitely think it's a treat that you were so up for experimenting and playing. And I do go back to that kind of Casey reveal moment because, again, like, how do you express what we were trying to say? We sort of like, it goes from one voice into another and it goes through a journey of sound, and you just did a few different versions, and then we got something that is just like my favorite moment in the series.
Yeah,
I love
that absolutely. So good. I love it as well because I don't really do sound design, not on podcasts. It's you don't get a chance to do something like that. I really loved it. And the funny thing is I actually used demos and trial versions of software. I don't own what I used. It was like a 14-day trial, and we were able to do the whole sound design within that.
Plugin then that you put, and then you could distort and then see if that was right, and then layer it.
Yeah. So I used Stutter from Isotope, and then Doubler, and then Vinyl, and then played with automation and pans and just sort of sending this and that to these plugins. Then we had the glitches, then we had several different tracks. Then you as well suggested the pitching, so we had automated pitching. That was quite a bit when I think about it. And I had to for that little bit, and I had to render it before the trial ran out, so I had it rendered as a stereo track because we were on draft 6 or something, and so that was really good. And music, definitely, it takes a lot of experimenting, a lot of trust, and I find you have to also leave your ego behind the door at least, you know, because when you say, oh, I don't like it, but I'm thinking, but I've made it. I wrote it. How can you not like it? And you cannot do that. You just have to leave it and be like, you know, I always think was the best for the story. That's the most important, what's happening there. Not music, not necessarily the narration, not the interviews, but the story, and everything else supports that story. That's the job of everything else. And I always say that audio is kind of invisible art. You shouldn't even hear it. You should just listen to the story, and you only notice it when there's something wrong with it. That's at least my approach.
I think definitely.
Never be,
like you were saying earlier, you don't want to be distracted.
No, you just want to experience whatever is happening there. And the biggest compliment is, like I said, you know, the compliment on the story, not on the music, not on that, because if someone compliments, that means they heard it, and we're not creating music, not music album, we're making stories. I guess it's the same with the movie. You know, you leave a cinema or a movie, you don't say, oh, amazing cinematography or score, or at least most people do that. They just say, what an amazing movie. The, you know, the final product, if you can use that word.
I also think there's a moment where a person in the Ramon episode goes into a club and he talks about a salsa club. I thought like some of that was quite interesting because the original track you put was super cool and really awesome, and like I loved it, and it was really hard decision to put the music he described, but he was like, I went into a salsa club and you kind of want to just hear the salsa music. So like it's sometimes putting something that's experimental really worked in other instances, and sometimes it's like the obvious choice that just means you are transported to that particular moment. So that's, you know, again, having enough time that you can try stuff out and it not be like, oh my god, we need to finish, and was good as well. Obviously we're a bit perfectionist.
We're so grateful to you for being happy to go on that journey with us and do all those drafts. But yeah, totally can empathize with that. You know, sometimes I think in terms of needing to service the story ultimately, and that being the most important thing. You know, I think we can definitely empathize with that from a writing point of view. Sometimes you love a moment, but you just have to kill your darlings. You know, just doesn't work.
That's true. Well, I want to ask about future plans, or is it too early? Any other ideas on the horizon? Season 2?
We've always got ideas. We're always cooking a few ideas in the background.
Definitely. We may, wait and see if there's a Pseudocide series 2. Yeah. If Mike will work with us again, and we'd love to do. There's so many other Pseudocide cases that we didn't get to investigate, that we had on our long list essentially, and we did some development work, but we didn't choose those to kind of make this series.
We've got lots in our back pocket that we found really intriguing, but we just didn't have the space for.
Exactly. And then otherwise, macabre, spooky, creepy, mysterious things are always up our street. We like graveyards, we like conspiracies, we like ghost stories. So if you have any, get in touch. firebrowmedia@gmail.com.
Love it. I love it. Well, I have a very last question before we go, and it's about, do you have an advice, maybe an advice for someone who like to do something similar, a podcast, maybe similar podcast? What would you say to a person watching or listening?
Find a partner in crime. Find someone that you really like working with most of the time. Joking. All the time. Find someone you love working with all of the time. It just makes it's just so much more fun. It's easier for all the reasons we've discussed about bouncing off each other, but it's also fun to be able to share it with someone and build in buffer time, as we discussed, like when you make your timeline, put an extra 2 weeks on the end.
And my tip would be develop your tastes, listen to loads of shows so you know what you like and what you would change and what they get wrong and what you're going to be different, because that's just hugely important. You've got to kind of be a bit of a podcast nut to be able to work out what your USP, what your unique thing is. Alice and I listen obsessively, and
that's true, we do.
Kind of think about moments that we like, and we can talk in that reference to each other. We sort of say like, oh, it'll feel like this, or that This American Life episode that stayed with us forever. And we always endeavor to make audio that makes someone maybe stop in their car and like want to finish it, or make their walk a little bit longer so they can hear that story. And my dream is that even if a few people who listen feel that way, I would feel really happy.
Yeah, I agree. And also just start doing it. Like, you don't need permission from anyone, especially in this day and age. It's so easy to record, to get out there, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money to do it. So I think just jump in and play around. That would be another piece of advice.
Yeah, our first show, our plan was just to make it and upload it on SoundCloud. We sort of thought it'd be polite to offer it to a few networks, and then Audible said they would buy it from us. So that we just made something we really loved that we would have made if no one paid us, and then someone did pay us.
Absolutely, 100% agree. Well, thank you for joining me. Thank you for your answers. Thank you for your show and for letting me help you out. I loved it. It was so different to what I normally do. And at first you're scared, you're out of your comfort zone, but that's the only way to grow. I find it's the only way to grow, to learn, to experience something new. So thank you. And
thanks
for anyone's watching or listening, Pseudocide, follow, subscribe, and listen. I hope you enjoyed our chat about Pseudocide. The podcast is available now to listen for free on Spotify, all 9 episodes. But that's it for today. I'm Mike Migas. If you enjoyed this video, you can check the rest of my channel or my website, mikemigas.com. For now, hit the like button and I'll see you later.